David Lee is an American poet who writes primarily about pigs, pig farming, pig farmers, and the people involved in the pig farming areas of the U.S. He lives in northern Idaho. About his subject matter, he explains, "We were loading a boar, a goddamn mean big son of a bitch, and he jumped out of the pickup 4 times and tore out my stock racks and rooted me in the stomach, and I fell down, and he bit John on the knee, and he thought it was broken, and so did I, and the boar stood over in the far corner of the pen and watched us, and John and I just sat there tired, and Jan laughed and brought us a beer, and I said, 'John, it ain't worth it. Nothing's going right, and I'm feeling half dead, and I haven't wrote a poem in ages, and I'm ready to quit it all.' And John said, 'Shit, young feller, you ain't got started yet, and the reason's 'cause you're trying to do it outside yourself and you ain't looking in. And if you want to by God write poems, you gotta write poems about what you know and not about the rest. And you can write about pigs and that boar and Jan and you and me and the rest here. There ain't no way you're gonna quit.' And we drank beer and smoked, all 3 of us, and finally loaded that mean bastard and drove him home and unloaded him, and he bit me again. And I went in the house and I got out my paper and pencils, and I started writing. And I found out John, he was right." This poem is called The Muffler and the Law. It's written in several sections, so I will call the section number before reading it. Part 1. "You got a sow in heat," John says this morning when he called. I said, "Oh yeah, John, I got 4 right now." John says, "It wouldn't one be that big black one, would it?" I said, "Yeah, she's in. I'm going to turn her in with the boar this afternoon." John says, "I'll be right down to get her. I want to borrow that sow." He hung up. John brought his beat-up truck to my house with his big spotted boar loaded in the back and a partition so another hog could be put in, but the boar couldn't get to it. He drove right out to my loading chute. By the time I got there, John was trying to load up my big black sow. I said, "John, what are you doing?" John looked at me like I was crazy. He says, "You gonna help me or stand there?" I didn't say anything else. I helped John load up my big black sow, and John drove off with her in his truck and never did say where. Part 2. Late afternoon, John drove up to my house. He honks. He yells, "Dave, come help me unload. This big black sow of yours, she's done bred. I don't need her no more." He drives out back to the loading chute and unloads the sow before I can get there. Part 3. "John," I said, "what the hell's going on? I mean, you come get my big black sow, drive off without telling me anything, and then you bring her back bred to your spotted boar. What if I didn't want her bred to him?" John says, "No charge, so it's all right then." I was going to tell him he could take the other 3 sows that were in for a ride all day tomorrow if he wanted, but John shut the gate on his stock racks and sat down on his tailgate. "It was this deputy sheriff," John says. So I said, "Which?" John says, "That one in Richfield. Last week, going to the auction at Salina. I run over this rock slide on the cutoff by Cove Fort. I busted my muffler pipe loose and all the brackets. I had to stop on the summit and fix it all up with baling wire. It took about an hour almost, and I was late for the auction, so I had to go. The muffler was loosed, and it made noise, but I didn't have no more time. I had to hurry. I got to Richfield. Here comes this law. His red lights on and his sirens honking right in the middle of town. I got out and says, 'I'm late to the auction.' He slams his car door and put his hand down on it, and he puts his other hand right down on his gun and says, 'I don't know where you from, mister, but in my town we got a law here.' I'm standing there with a truckload of hogs, people driving by slow looking at me right in the middle of Richfield. I says, 'I'm late to the auction again. What I done wrong this time?' He says, 'In my town we got a law against loud mufflers, so you gonna have to pay a fine for it, mister.' I says, 'Look, I done hit this rock slide coming and busted and tried to wire it up, but I couldn't. You look under here, you can see. I'm late to the auction.' His red lights was still going. I bent down to show him the wire underneath. He jumped in his car and taking out his microphone, he called the other law. So I stood up. He says, 'You stand right there.' I says, 'Where?' He says, 'You stand right there.' He jumps out his car and puts his hand on his gun again and says, 'You trying to resist arrest on me?' I says, 'No, I'm trying to show you the baling wire under here, holding up the pipes in the muffler where I hit the rock on the mountain, but I can't hold the muffler on right, and the auction starts in 15 minutes. He says, 'You just stand right there still. I got reinforcement coming. We gonna arrest you.' Part 4. I said, "What happened, John?" John says the other law, he come, and they both wrote me out a ticket for loud mufflers and resisting arrest, and the other one that come says he believed I was speeding too, but they never wrote a ticket for it, and that's too bad, 'cause I was late for the auction. I says, "Can I go now?" But the law, he says, "You got to pay your fine." I says, "The auction started 5 minutes ago, and I got to get there." The other law, he says, "Why you going to the auction? You selling hogs?" I never says a word to that dumb son of a bitch. He's standing right there by my truck, loaded up with 12 top hogs, wallering each other in the middle of the town. All the cars driving by watching. The first law says, "You got to follow us to the JP." I says, "Isn't it no other way?" He says, "You trying to bribe an officer of the law?" I says, "Hell no, I'm trying to get to the auction." The other law says, "Whar?" And the first says, "Selena, they sell hogs at 1. I says, "That was 10 minutes ago." The other law says, "You selling these hogs?" But I wasn't talking to him. Law says, "You want a regular judge, you can come back next Friday, but the fine goes up for that." I says, "Can I go now?" And the law says, "Yeah." But the other one says, "Not till you get that muffler fix." I had to get my truck towed to a filling station 4 blocks away, and the muffler pipe welted, and he charged me $47.65 to do it. I could have done it for $1 at home if I had my tools, but by then the auction was over. I had to drive all them pigs home after I'd loaded them up that morning to take to the auction at Selena. Part 5. I said, "That's too bad, John." John says, "I couldn't sleep about it for a man to talk to me that way. All he had to done was look under the truck so he could see it wasn't my fault. I tried to fix it best I could." He says the fine would go up, so I says to myself, "John, it's done costed $50 almost, so you might as well get your say out of it." But I didn't have no sow in heat, so that's how come I called you. I said, "John, I don't understand." John says, "I drove to Richfield with that panel between the hogs between my spotted boar. He about chewed it in two trying to get to your big black sow, but he couldn't. So I went right to the spot where that law pulled me over in the middle of town. I stopped my truck and got out and climbed up on the stock racks, took out the panel, let the boar go to her." I said, "You did what?" John says, "By God, she wasn't quite ready yet. She squawked, and here comes the cars to see. I bet they could hear her half a mile. Then here come the law with his red lights on. He says, 'What in the hell is you doing?' I says, 'I am here to pay my fine.' He says, 'You get that truck out of here. Them pigs people watching.' I says, 'Whar?' He waved his arms. He says, 'Everywhere. See 'em? They all coming.' I says, 'I got to pay my fine. I come to go to court.' He says, 'Whar?' I says, 'Right here.' Lord, it was horrible. My spotted boar, he slobbered all over your black sow. It was hog slobber on both her ears. That law's as red in the face as a fox's ass. He couldn't do nothing. He finally says, 'Get your truck, you foller me.' I says, 'That's fine, but go slow. I got a load of hogs in mine. Can't be jostling 'em any,' as we drove to the courthouse. Part 6. Judge, he says, 'What's going on?' Law, he says, 'Your Honor, he's disturbing the peace.' Judge, he says, 'How?' Law, he says, 'He's got these pigs in his truck, and they're copperlating in the middle of town.' Judge, he says, 'Whar?' Law, he says, 'Right out there.' So Judge gets up, and he looks out his winder, and there's my truck, but by now my spotted boar, he's done. He's layin' down. He wasn't getting up. He was pooped. Judge says, 'All I see is a hog.' Law says, 'But they was scrutin'.' Judge, he says, 'Don't you talk that way in a court of law, you hear me? All I see is a hog, and it ain't no law that says a man can't haul no hog through town in his truck yet.' So I says, 'Your Honor, I want you to listen to my side of this.' So I told him the whole story about the muffler and the law, how I missed the auction, and he looks at that law, he says, 'Is it the way it happened, like he says?' Law, he commenced to squirmin', but he has to say yasser, and finally I told him how it costed me $50 almost to get it fixed, and I had to be towed 4 blocks with 12 top hogs in the truck. Judge, he says, 'Case dismissed.' Then he says to me he's sorry about it all, especially the $50. So I says, 'It's the way it is. Can't nothing be done now.' I didn't have no more hard feelings, so we shaken hands and I left. Law, he's mad as hell outside waiting. He says, 'Mister, you ever come to my town again, I'll make you sweat. I'll arrest your ass and throw you in jail.' I says, 'Mr. Deputy Sheriff Law, you listen here and you listen good. You ever bother me again for anything, next time I'll pull a trailer and bring 8 sows and 3 boars all together. I'll park in front of the schoolhouse and take out the panel. I'll go in and tell 'em you says for me to meet you there, and where are you? You post to have the money for them hogs. If you don't believe it, you just try. And I says then, so you just get out of my way. I walked on past him and went and left. He never says one more word to me. Part 7. So here's your big black sow, John said, and he stood up. She's done bred to my spotted boar, but you don't owe me nothing. I ain't never won one with the law before, so I reckon this one's on me. John closed his tailgate and leaned in and patted his spotted boar on the head, and then John got in his beat-up pickup truck and drove home for supper. Some questions to think about. Who do you think is the worst person in this story? Most might say the law was. Do you think that John was necessarily right in the way that he treated the pigs and the people around him in the town by bringing in the sow who was not yet fully in heat, having that boar go after her in the middle of town? Question 2. Do you think the judge was completely fair in how he treated both the police officer and John? Or does it seem like the judge was maybe biased more towards John than the police officer? Was the police officer really only doing his job? Question 3. Do you know anyone who behaves like the police officer, who, just because they have a tiny bit of power in a tiny area of town, takes that power and wields it like a bat against everyone around him? Do you think that this poem encapsulates human nature in general? That some people are always going to want more power and some people are always going to be disadvantaged? Do you think that John bringing his truck by and just picking up the sow without even telling David why it was he was doing it was necessarily fair to David? David may have been able to get in trouble for it. So shouldn't John have told him why he wanted the sow before he took her? On the surface, this seems like a fairly funny little story. But if you look a little deeper, you'll see that there are a lot of parts going on. There's friendship in between David and John. There's trust. There's mistrust. There's fairness. There's unfairness. Who do you think was the most fair? Who do you think was the most unfair? Was it necessarily right of John to threaten the officer to bring three more hogs and 6 sows and let him go at it outside the school? And do you think that would necessarily be fair to the kids inside who would have to witness it? Do you believe that this poem is a comedy or a tragedy, or perhaps both?